call the Neighborhood Development Committee to order. Madam Clerk, please call the roll.
Alderman Moore. Alderwoman Howard.
Present.
Alderwoman Hubbard.
Present.
Alderwoman Murphy.
Here.
Alderwoman Spencer.
Present.
Alderman Gunther.
Here.
Alderman Oldenburg. Chairman Cone.
Present.
You have 6 present. You have quorum.
Thank you. So the purpose for today's meeting, we're actually not hearing any board bills this morning. We scheduled the meeting to hear Resolution 104. Do we have that resolution before the committee? Okay. So Resolution 104 is pertaining to
They changed it.
tax abatements for residential projects in the city of St. Louis under $1 million, which are typically projects that are heard before this committee. So I wanted to make sure that we had the opportunity to review the resolution in committee and ask any questions of SLDC relative to the proposed changes in how we conduct business with regard to tax abatements. So with that, I'll turn the floor over.
Matt Bauer from SLDC, thanks for having this hearing. So I wanted to kind of provide some context and go through the thinking on how we developed the map, and also some improvements we're making to the model on the other side. To provide some upfront context, the PFM study looked at in SLDC and incentives a couple of years ago. Three goals were outlined for SLDC to work towards as part of that study. And the first was established. There was actually 5 goals, but 3 were more directly pertaining to this work. First was establish a framework for reporting and analyzing incentives data, and to build the greater quantitative measures for the application scoring process. So as part of that, John created the incentives model that we're currently using. And that provides us a detailed quantitative analysis of especially the larger development proposals, benefits to the city, amount of benefits to the developer, et cetera. It also required additional reporting from incentive recipients. So we're in the process of establishing better reporting requirements and actively doing some asset management, trying to go back out to the larger projects to track what they're doing in an ongoing process, starting more rigorous follow-up. And also the city is actively working on the CityWorks database in conjunction with SLDC. We've hired new IT personnel that are working on the database, which will allow us to more easily track these projects on an ongoing basis and actually have a workable database to put that information in and create reporting from. And then we also, I think one of the biggest ones was focus the incentive use around a citywide plan for development. So we have selected we issued RFP a couple months ago. We had 17 consultant teams from across the country doing work in cities from Brooklyn to Dallas-Fort Worth to Detroit. So big national firms that applied. We cut that down to 6 that we got final proposals from and interviewed, and then we've selected one preferred team at this point, and we're in negotiations with that team. So we hope to get that work started in about a month or so. That process will take we anticipate taking about a year, and I think there'll be some interim deadlines to meet with requirements set forth by the alderman previously. So first off, we'll talk about go back to the model. We'll set the map aside for now, but talk about why we also use a model. First off, we get a variety of different projects in all shapes and sizes from a wide variety of different developers. So it might be a multifamily property with no commercial, or we might get a mixed use. We need one way to capture all that information and analyze it in one way. Developers each have their own models, so we need a way to take all that information and put it into one consistent model for us to analyze, and also to take that data that they provide and store it in a usable fashion, which will eventually link to that database that I spoke about earlier. So we can start doing some reporting and analysis of multiple projects across time, as opposed to just looking at them one off, which is kind of where we are now. Once that database is ready, we can go back to the models that we've had over the last 2 years and put that data into a database and start doing some analysis. It provides a quantitative analysis of the proposals, so we can estimate the benefit that the tax benefits the city gets. We can then estimate the benefit that the tax abatement gives to the developers and weigh the cost and benefits. Whereas if we just used a map to determine where incentives go, we wouldn't have that type of background data. We wouldn't know how much benefit the city is getting for it. That's why the model is essential, especially for those big projects, is to determine exactly how much benefit we're getting from the projects. Also, I think the model, its scoring, as we try to boost the tax revenue through the use of the model, it tends to incentivize denser development, which is good for the city in that density is a more efficient use of our land and also our services. It's easier to provide services to a lot of people in a smaller area than people spread out over a wide area. So it's just from a financial point of view, it's also a benefit. We do realize that there are things that can be improved. I think a lot of the model is obviously a big, huge model, and it's difficult for you and the general public to understand. So I've put together a 2-page white paper that's actually included, a big section of that is included as part of the resolution to kind of explain what the goals and the purposes of the model are. That could be used by you and the general public, or if you're ever in a position of having to try to explain it to somebody. I wouldn't expect you to go deep into the model, but a 1-page explanation with a few simple graphs. The graphs are not part of the amendment, but I can provide that to you. It's just easier and more accessible to the general public. We've also worked on, John and I together have worked on the model itself to make the input sections a lot more easy to understand for the developers that are doing it, or we can also, for your benefit, to print out those input pages so that you can see what we're looking at and what the developer is providing in a more easily digestible format. And that is in place now. We also created and I'll get to this later, a project dashboard which shows the tax benefits to the city and the tax benefits to the developer in a more clear-cut, easy to understand way. So I'll get to that later. And then we're also trying to do some outreach to, as part of this process, we had meetings with you, the aldermen. We've been talking with developers and also the general public and public interest groups, even including Team TIF, about some of these changes. So we're trying to do more public outreach, and we recognize that that's needed. Now we'll move on to the map. So I think the map is beneficial in that it provides some certainty to probably 80% of the projects that we see coming through with incentives requested. It would provide you certainty with constituents calling or developers calling, looking for some guidance up front as to what they might expect. We can go through what that means going forward, but it still gives you and us some leeway to, as I've spoken with several aldermen that don't exactly like what the map is saying in their area, but we can talk about that further. Obviously, a map is easier to understand than a model. It visually represents what we could recommend for the certain areas of the city. And smaller rehabbers, smaller developers, rehabbers, and do-it-yourselfers really just don't have the capacity nor the time to deal with a large financial model like some of the larger developers might do. So we don't want to have to put them through that process. And just as mentioned before, it sets the guidelines and expectations of what certain areas of the city might expect up front, as opposed to waiting for the process to go through. But we do, again, recognize there's limitations of the map. It doesn't capture the development data that we're capturing with the financial model. We're not able to determine what potential benefit there is to the city if we just are awarding abatement based on a map. From the point of view of using a map for commercial projects, the commercial data is just not as readily available in a publicly available, like demographic data or mortgage data or building permit data, to put it together in a mappable format. I think what Dale and I talked about is we could still look at that map as a general guideline, but it is not. We will still be using the financial model for bigger commercial projects. And then some more soft limitations of a map, and it's kind of what we've talked about with some individual aldermen, is we all have preconceptions of what a certain area should be, and trying to, number one, sometimes those preconceptions are correct, and the map shows that sometimes those preconceptions might be incorrect, and we have to look at why that is. Also, the problem with consensus is we know that not everybody is going to agree on one single map, and that was one of our difficulties here going in, because everybody has their own ideas of some aldermen like to award as much incentive as possible, others don't want to. So we all have difficulty coming to consensus. And then we recognize that there's probably going to be exceptions and how to deal with that. Some specific ones we've discussed are historic, ideals for historic preservation. Obviously, affordable housing, we want to preserve and promote affordable housing. So if there's an affordable housing development in a dark green zone, we still want to be able to award abatement to make those projects more viable. And then just some, on the bottom of that page is just some examples of preconceptions, exceptions in that issues that we were kind of struggling with as we went through developing the map process. And that's like, what happens if you have a long vacant house on a block in a well-established neighborhood? What do you do about that? Do you stick to the map? Is that an exception? We've seen single-family teardowns and huge, new, expensive houses built on the hill, but the hill is, got a lot of seniors on limited incomes and smaller homes, so that it projects on the map as a lower income area, yet it's getting all this activity, so that's an issue. And then we have $500,000 homes going up in the Grove, an area that has traditionally been a lower income area, and then some blocks of that area are still very low income. Similar issues on just off of Cherokee. So those are kind of some of the issues that we were dealing with as we were going through the map. So we have to acknowledge that there is no perfect map. We can't capture exactly what's going on the ground at this moment. The data that we're using is generally from the census, federal sources, and is typically lagged by about 2 years. The map is updatable every year as that data is released, but there's no way we can account for the lag there. Again, back to my point is everybody has preconceived notions, so while the map might be good for one area, it might not that it won't be good, but while we think it's meeting our preconceived notions in one area, it might not be meeting preconceived notions in the other area. And then as we were going through that, we were dealing with that and seeing like, okay, we think this area should be this, but it's really showing it as awarding a lot of abatement. So you fix that issue, and then another issue popped. We were playing whack-a-mole. So we went through 4 major editions of the map, and we feel that this one is kind of best meets what we view our view of the city, and I hope I hope it meets your expectations too, although we realize that there's going to be census blocks that might not. And we just either have to accept that or go through an exception process to deal with those issues. Again, the map will guide our decisions, but we don't want it to make our decisions. So we want to obviously limit we would like it to make as many decisions as possible, but we want to have a fair process for as we discussed, if there's disagreements about what it should be. Things have come up here, things have come up in HUDs of specific issues, so we want to have that process in place, and I think the resolution tries to address some of those issues. I think other things that we'll be looking at as we make decisions in addition to the model is looking at sales comps if necessary, to drill down on some specific issues if they come up. Site inspections and looking at vacancies in specific blocks. So what we did to make the map specifically, again, we talked about getting input we had small group meetings with most aldermen. We had meetings with the mayor and her staff. We had a meeting with the Home Builders Association. We've met with several public interest groups, and we consulted various other staff at SLDC, so including LRA, the neighborhood commercial district managers, et cetera. Then kind of spoke about this a little bit, but as we went through the process and gathered the data, we tried to look for specific specific block groups that we know were problematic or could go one way or another. And as we fine-tuned the data, we kind of looked at those key census block groups to make sure that those were meeting what we believe were our expectations of what those should be, to do the best we could to make that map a true reflection of where we stand today. So the next slide just shows exactly kind of where we're at and how the map, what goes into making the map. So we looked at two kind of global factors, and then had under each there was smaller specific data that informed us. So first, we weighted at about 60%, was the current condition of the neighborhood. What does the neighborhood look like today? And for that, we relied heavily on census data. And what we did was we collected census data and then compared that data to the whole MSA. So I think it's the 16 county region. So we wanted to see how a condition of a census block compared to the region as a whole. And so what you'll see on that map is any area in the dark green meets or exceeds the regional kind of the regional norm, and then it scales down from there. So the specific data we looked at was median home value, including value per room, and we used that as a proxy for the size of a home, because what we were finding is some homes in areas were, going back to the Hill, the homes are very small, but on a value per room basis, they might be very high. So and homes in the county are generally a lot larger than homes in the city, so we needed to normalize that a little bit. So we used room value per room as a proxy for size. Median income is pretty self-explanatory. We looked at median income change over a 5-year period. So that kind of shows neighborhood improvement, so we wanted to get that in there too. Median rent, because some areas had a lot of rental units. And then also building vacancy. In this case, we used census data for building vacancy, so we could compare it to the regional. And then we also, at one point we used building permit data, but that was problematic for several reasons. So we went to home mortgage activity from federal data. And so we looked at loans per 1,000 population, the average amount of a home loan, and the loan per number of occupied units. So that kind of, in some areas that the condition is not doing well, but they're seeing a lot of activity that helped adjust for that. So then, I already talked about how we're looking at the index, so every census block is indexed to the regional average, so a score of 1, which is anything in dark green or above, is equal to or better than the regional average. And then that's scaled down to, I mean, there was some at 25% of the regional average, but you can see here how that next table shows kind of the distribution of the 360 census block groups in the city. So if you look at the most seriously in need, we combine those two, that's 31%, and those with no abatement are 30%. So we thought kind of that balance of how the census block groups turned out was a good balance and kind of met with our expectations and our preconceived notions of the city. We did make, from our initial presentation to HUDs on September 26, we did make some major changes. One I talked about a little bit, and that was the replacement of building permit data with the mortgage data. It's a more reliable data set since it's collected on, it's federally collected. It's collected on all federal home mortgages, and it's used to make sure banks are complying with their neighborhood reinvestment requirements. We are having problems with using building permit data, especially because many affordable projects are scattered site, so it would show a lot of building activity in census block groups that didn't really have market building activity. So it was throwing some obviously needy census block groups into the green category when that really should not have been. And the affordable housing data is so scattered among different sources, it was just really difficult to eliminate that from our calculations. And it also, the building permit data didn't allow us to compare that with the regional data, whereas the mortgage data we could compare to the regional data. So that kept a more consistency throughout the model. Another change that occurred out of the discussion with the HUD's committee is, you'll notice the purple census block groups is we categorized, that was not there originally, but it was categorized as an area of extreme need. These are areas that index at 35%, at only 35% of the regional average, and so they requested that we had utilize the maximum amount of abatement that we could afford. So that's the purple area. And then another big thing was more specifically outlining an exception process. I didn't put it here, but generally those historic structures, so not just structures in a historic neighborhood, but specifically historic structures, would be given great leeway in awarding abatement, because especially with the reduction of historic tax credits and the ability to get the state historic tax credits and the ability to get them, they're going to need a lot more assistance. Affordable housing and green housing. We LEED certified silver or above. All of these are going to be more expensive to build and need more assistance. So we would look favorably upon exceptions to those types of projects. But we are aware of instances where an alderman or a developer might seek exceptions for various reasons. I think one specific one that was brought up is I don't have the map in front of me, but there's an area along Delmar where like 2 or 3 blocks north of Delmar is in the green because it's part of a census block group with almost the heart of the Central West End. So if somebody was trying to get abatement in those blocks to say no to that because it's just grouped in with a larger portion of the census block group that is obviously not in need, that would be a great example of where an exception would be. So in that case, we would do a more we would want the alderman's support on that, and also go out and do a more in-depth analysis of why that exception would be awarded. So we would look at sales comps on the immediate block and surrounding blocks, look at vacancies and the condition of the specific block, and kind of compare that to the wider census block group and demonstrate that there is a need here that is an exception to what the map says. And that analysis would go along with our recommendation and the eventual board bill for that abatement, so it would be front and center. And I think that takes care of that. Oh, and then the other addition was an abatement cap, which from the HUD's committee meeting was determined to be, and this is flexible, but we want to obviously identify it and keep it as standard as possible, is to avoid awarding abatement for super high value homes. We would cap the abatement at 90% of Fannie Mae's conforming loan limit. So that 90%, I think the loan limit is like not 457 or 458,000. So that would be, so the 90% is 407,000. And the way we would adjust it is just, this graph kind of tries to show how that would occur. So we're looking at a $100,000 acquisition cost and a $400,000 improvement. So we'd have a $500,000 total value on this project. And if that, let's say that was in an area that was awarded 90% abatement, what we would do is adjust that abatement down to 77% to effectively cap it at the 407. Because we don't have a mechanism in place to actually set a cap, we would have to just adjust the amount of the level of abatement to, in effect, create a cap. So this would basically just limit the use of abatement for very high value homes. And then and now we go back to the model. We talked a little bit about this up front, but basically there's no underlying changes to the model. We're not changing the model anyway. We're just making it more usable and more like user-friendly. So I discussed about, we have updated the user input tab to make it easier for the developers to enter it, and also for us to print it out and provide to you if you're interested in, or the public if there is more interest in seeing exactly what numbers are going into the model. And then on the output side, and that's on the next page, is where we created a dashboard, and in addition to the 5-star rating that John came up with, this dashboard will kind of more clearly show what benefits we're seeing from the city, and what benefits are going to the developer. I'll go through that real quick later after we go through this slide. I mentioned the white paper, which is available. I can send that to anybody who's interested, and like I said, a big chunk of that is in the resolution already. We're trying to put we're working towards putting the model online so that developers can fill out the application online, and then the data they input would go directly into a database where we can do more reporting in the future on what information we get from projects. And then that scorecard that comes out of the model could be posted online for every project that's awarded TIF or tax abatement. These are the projects over $1 million. And then we're always looking for your suggestions, other people's suggestions for what improvements we can make to the model and how we can incorporate that. It's kind of small, but I think we went over this in some of the smaller Aldermanic meetings, but basically on the right side of the page is the incentive, just the incentive of the summaries that's being considered, and then the sources and uses of the project. The graph is kind of front and center. The yellow line is the financial benefit to the city from the project with the incentives in place. The dotted line what you can't quite see, but it's the gray line at the bottom, and it seems like it's a bottom border for the graph, but in actuality, that's what the project is currently, or the parcel or site is currently producing for the city. The dotted line, the next highest line is the dotted line. That's the average for that type of project across the whole city. Whether it be commercial or multifamily, and it's weighted. If it's a mixed-use property, it's weighted. The blue line is the neighborhood average. So what a project for that type. So if we're looking at Tower Grove South in apartment buildings, this would be the average tax generation of apartment buildings in that general area. And then the red line is the city sustainability line, that how much a project needs to generate to kind of be sustainable financially for the city over the long term. And as we see in every case, the blue line is below the red line, so we need to catch up in all cases. And then down the middle is the tax performance per square foot of parcel area. That just kind of puts numbers to the graph. Below that is the developer's return. So what we want to do is balance the developer's need for incentives with what is typically expected in the market, and we get those numbers from Real Estate Research Corporation, which publishes quarterly indicators of what IRRs are being required for development in the St. Louis area. So that kind of compares what the market projected return is to what the developer's return is. And then along the left side, it just kind of puts numbers to what the benefit for the city is over a 10-year period and a 20-year period. A break-even analysis. So how basically in that first one, it's how long would it take? We're saying this project is better than the neighborhood average, but we're giving them incentives so they're paying less taxes. How long does it take that project to kind of pay the deficit of taxes? It kind of racks up in its incentive period over a longer period, because if it never meets the neighborhood average, and then there's no break even, or that break even is 30 years out, then that makes us think that this project either shouldn't get incentives or should get significantly less incentives. This sample project didn't have a TIF, but it would have a TIF payoff year. Down below it also gives the incentive value to the project, and then just some general information about the property status. Is it in what MVA category it is in? Is it an existing building, and what the strategic land use is? And then just some other things that we're trying to do. I think part of the process is informing, being in contact with you about the recommendations up front, so that we can have discussions as necessary. If there's a need for exceptions, we deal with that early on rather than later in spring, so no more surprises. And then we've been adding projects that are not recommended, where abatement is not recommended to the board, to the minutes, to the agenda in the minutes, just so that there's more awareness from you and the public that there are circumstances where incentives are requested and they're not awarded, because I think previously that was not apparent, because everything that went to the LCRA board had a recommendation of positive recommendation for abatement, and it never came out that some things are actually rejected. We're going to start to look at building permits and attaching abatement to building permits, and see abatements and affordability to some building permits, to see on an ongoing basis what we're doing. So that's some data there that came out of an initially of that process. And again, we're open to your suggestions for improvements to the process and to some of the reporting. So that concludes my portion of the presentation, and thank you for the opportunity. Available to answer any questions.
So I'm going to hold questions for the moment, and thank you for that.
Okay.
Otis, did you want to add anything at all? You don't have to if you...
Oh, but let me formally apologize to the committee for running late. I mentioned, at least I sent a text to the chair to apologize, but to you all as well. Unfortunately, I double booked and couldn't get away from the person that I double booked at 8:30. They were exciting and wouldn't let me get away, but I'm here. So one of the things I wanted to do here, had I been here at the very beginning, would have tried to emphasize what he actually ended up on, is that there are a lot of good things that are happening here, and that this process has evolved over time, and we are here to get your recommendations on how to improve it. It will continue to evolve as we learn more. But if I go back about 3 years when we first had the incentive study done by PFM, and I think it goes to actually the second slide that you have, which sort of sets the context for it, and I think Matt may have spoken to it. It's just that we had a number of recommendations that came out of that study, and we have in fact been trying to implement all of those recommendations, one by hiring John and now Matt to do more quantitative analysis, to actually look at different reporting mechanisms and how we can get more information, putting information into our agreements and those things to try and make sure we get data. I think it also led to your directing us to provide a report back to you in September of next year that essentially provides a lot of numbers and be able to evaluate where we are. So this is a process, an evolution that we are here to work with you on. We are, I think the last bullet on that page says that we were going to do an economic development strategy or a plan, and we are on course doing that. As you know, we did an RFP. There were 17 firms that initially submitted. We narrowed it down to 6, and we are now having discussions with, we actually then moved down to the top 2, and we have a firm that we will be discussing with you. We will bring that back to the board and make you aware of who that firm is once we get more negotiations behind us. So with that, the team is here to be able to respond to any of your questions. I think the map is a product that people have looked at through our process going through HUDs. We did modify it. We're here to hear what your comments are and recommendations are as well.
Thank you, Otis. And I first want to thank the members of SLDC over the last several months. As the committee is aware, I kind of halted committee hearings for a while until we were able to get this map put together. We had, I think, our first committee hearing about 2 weeks ago. It was very frustrating for me as a chair and also a member of this body. I've been down here for almost 10 years now, and I've served both as a member of this committee and now as chair, where there weren't metrics in place, to evaluate these decisions in the past. And it was very frustrating, particularly when I was a new member of this body, and we were passing board bills for tax abatement, for 15 years in some of these areas that we can now call green, whereas areas that are purple, we wouldn't see any tax abatement in those areas because how could we give 40 years of abatement away? I mean, Craig Schmidt, who was the alderwoman from the 20th Ward's predecessor, and I both served on this committee as members, and were very frustrated by a lot of the activity that we saw down here. So it's taken many years to get to this point, but I'm happy that we're finally here having this discussion. I did want to, for clarity purposes, talk about the process a little bit and what that means for SLDC, LCRA, and this committee. And so could you or Dale, one of you, just
please.
elaborate on like what the process will look like going forward in terms of, you know, a developer approaches the city for tax abatement?
I'm going to
let's
defer to
start
Dale
there.
just because he's living this process, so I'll let him speak.
Okay.
But essentially, we are making some changes. I think one of them that he spoke to that I didn't want to get past, and that is that we used to bring things to our planning, our agenda prep is what we call it, agenda prep meeting, and if it wasn't something that we were going to recommend tax abate on, we would not take it to the board. And so it looked like we were doing 100%. And so that change, we decided now that we will bring everything so that people get a sense of if there are things that we are turning down, you can get to see what those are as well.
So, and to be clear, part of my reason for wanting to walk through this is I had a colleague last week who is under the impression that we will no longer see board bills for tax abatement coming through this body. So I just, you know, I want to get on the record what the process will be going forward. So, for the
Okay.
record.
Well, obviously, we'll first entertain applications, and you can go to our website and find our application. It should be simple, but we're happy to email it out or mail it out or whatever any potential developer might want to get a copy of that application and submit it. And then they go into two stacks. If it's a commercial project or if it's one that's exceeding $1 million, then we'll go in the stack where we'll look at that compared with the financial model. If it's a project of, residential project of less than $1 million, we will then look at the map and determine where it is on the map, and then look at the project itself to see if there are things about it that might be an exception. There might be something special. As Matt mentioned, it might be a historic building, it might be affordable housing, it might be some isolated building that for 20 years has been a problem on a block, and even though the block in general is pretty good, no one has stepped forth to renovate that building, and some kind of an incentive might be in order as a result to get that particular building up and going. So we'll look at all of that, and then again, as Otis mentioned, a week before our LCRA meets, we have an agenda prep meeting, and that's when all of us get together and we look at these various factors, and based on that, come up with a recommendation of perhaps no abatement. And as Otis mentioned, that will be noted in our agenda to the LCRA if we're recommending no abatement on a particular application. Or whatever that level of abatement may be, we'll come to a conclusion. And after that agenda prep meeting, a week before, we will inform the alderman and the developer of what our recommendation is. This gives them an opportunity to say, well, now wait a minute, I have a lot of reasons why that's not the right recommendation. And if indeed we're all in negotiation on that, then perhaps we won't even put it on the agenda that month at the LCRA. Hopefully we'll come to a conclusion. And in most cases, I'm hoping that everyone will say, well, that's a reasonable recommendation, and therefore we'll move ahead. The Friday before the Tuesday LCRA meeting, today, for example, we send out that agenda, and that agenda will then include the recommendation specifically, and that agenda is open for everyone to see, so everyone will know what those recommendations are even before the LCRA meets to discuss them. The LCRA then will either concur in that recommendation, or they too have an opportunity to modify that recommendation if they feel strongly, or perhaps if anyone should show up. It is a public meeting to plead a case that either we're recommending too much or not enough, but then the LCRA will make a recommendation to the Board of Aldermen. Then obviously it's the alderman of the ward that introduces that legislation, and he or she has another opportunity to alter that recommendation if indeed they want to introduce a bill that is different from that recommendation, they have that opportunity to do that. And then we'll put it on the agenda. As you know, a project out in the neighborhoods of unoccupied property come to this committee, and to the HUD's committee come all the TIF projects and projects that are in the downtown area or projects that involve occupied property. They go to the HUD's committee. It's up to the chairman as to which committee it goes in, but that's generally, I mean the president, as to which committee the various projects go to, but that's generally what we have been doing. And then, as you know, we put them all on an agenda, we arrive at a date, and we have a meeting such as this to discuss whatever is on the agenda for that particular time, and it goes through the normal process. So that's how we see it going. It's different from what we've done before. We would welcome an input early if an alderman wants to do it. We certainly would like an indication early if for some reason it's a project you don't even like, because there's no reason for us to spin our wheels if for a variety of reasons unknown to us, it may not be a good project even though someone has applied for tax abatement.
So
Any questions?
To be clear, the process isn't changing with the adoption of this resolution or the map. So the process that we've been using in terms of legislatively.
Oh, no, it doesn't change at all.
That won't change.
That's
So-
dictated by the state statutes. So we notice in the newspaper the time of the public hearing and all of that. That whole process established by state statute does not change.
So I just want to be very clear about this because of the concerns of one of my colleagues
So
from last
let
Friday.
me try to address
We are
that.
not going to usurp the authority of the aldermen in terms of presenting board bills down and I'm specifically with projects that conform to the map. We understand that there's an exception process, but for projects that conform to the map, aldermen will still be, required to sponsor a board bill.
Okay, so let
Well,
me,
if they don't conform to the map, that's an exception, and there's always going to be, right. So, but specifically, I want to make sure that this is clear for folks because it came up, and I'm sure it might come up in discussion on Friday, so I just want to make sure I have the answers, and, and I know I have the answers, but I want to make sure that it's all on the record, so.
okay. So let me be clear that everything that is done through Chapter 99 and Chapter 100 will be coming through the Board of Aldermen. I think what you may have heard is, and so that's how some of the discussion has come about, is that the Port Authority does have Chapter 68 that is also state directed. And so that one is one that is approved by the Port Authority, but it would use the same guidelines as this map. But also we know that the Port Authority has a limited boundary, and so that was part of. Okay, and so we also know that there's some discussion that we all need to have about parameters around the Port Authority, and so that particular one is on hold for the time being, so we have that discussion. So the answer to your question, at this time, Chapter 99 and Chapter 100 is the vehicle for doing it. Okay?
Thank you. The other 2 points that I wanted to ask about, because I've been involved in these discussions for the greater part of the past year with you all, and at one point in time we had discussed that there would be kind of a qualifier, which I would think would be in the resolution, which is that we would not be projects in order to qualify for the map would have to be 100% of the acquisition cost or more, and I don't see that in here. Do you all remember that conversation? Because
Well,
we
we
wanted-
have, and
so
we've
someone brought-
wrestled with that one. I mean, if you want to insert something, that would be fine. The challenge is, and particularly this goes in the most challenged neighborhoods, is that sometimes you can make a reasonable difference. For example, if you're rehabbing a house and you have a lot of sweat equity in it, your numbers may not come out all that high, and actually what you're going to put into it, and yet it may well be worthwhile. I mean, and then we have industrial projects. Of course, that's outside of this map.
Right.
But industrial projects where someone pays a lot of money for a building, and maybe they're going to spend $1 million for the building and $200,000 to rehab it, but they're going to bring jobs, and there are other reasons why an incentive is certainly in order. So though we wrestled with that, we couldn't really come up with what we thought was reasonable. And I don't know if, Matt, you have anything to add to that?
No,
but,
I mean, that was a part of I think Dale said it directly, is we got a lot of feedback from the north side aldermen about that specific.
Right.
They wanted the ability to incentivize homeowners that are willing to make improvements that are not equal to the value of their home.
But even in cases of, I mean, I represent an area that is, similar in
Yeah,
some
yeah.
parts to North St.
Oh, yeah.
Louis in terms of value. I don't understand why would we, even with sweat equity.
Yeah.
Even with sweat equity, if you're rehabbing a house, bathrooms and kitchens are still going to cost you a lot of money.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, at the end of the day, you're buying a property in North St. Louis or even Southeast City, for maybe if you're lucky, 80, 90 grand. I think my last appraisal for my 2-family flat was $65,000. So, if I'm being generous, we can say, $100,000 just to be on the generous side, and if I go through and do a rehab of my place, it's probably like with my own sweat equity in there, it might cost me, $30,000, and so it would probably cost me more because I have a 2-family and I have, 2 kitchens and all of that I would need to update. But I feel like there should be a basis somewhere for the ability to receive abatement, because otherwise, why are we providing the abatement? We should not be, incentivizing, projects that are not providing value. And so, I mean, just by virtue of me painting the outside of my house, I had a reassessed value that was greater, than any improvements that I actually made on the interior there. So while we're going through this process, I feel as though we want to incentivize projects that are actually adding value and quality, to the housing stock in the city, right?
Right. And we do not disagree, and we would be more than open to putting that clause in there if we can agree to, and not we, I mean, generally, I think if we can come to an agreement on some level that's appropriate.
But if you look at the math, what happens is that in some neighborhoods where there's a small investment inside of the house, it's not apparent, particularly when the assessment goes around. And so the city, I mean, generally the abatement obviously is abated at the last tax level. And so the tax level probably isn't going to change because they've been, but I guess what I'm saying is that if you even granted the 5-year tax abatement, there would be no noticeable difference in the amount of money that the city received. I don't know, sometimes I think people aren't really aware of what the consequences of tax abatement really is, and how does it really impact your ability, I mean, your how much taxes you pay. And so
yeah, there's a common misnomer that it actually eliminates the taxes
yeah,
that you're paying.
exactly. So that really means that you will continue, that person, even though they put their $30,000 into their bathroom or kitchen or whatever, or both, that if the exterior of the house still looks the way that it did in the past, it'd probably be assessed at the same,
Right.
Whatever.
But it could also, I mean, if the map's going to be on it will be on the website, we might be getting a flood of, I mean, that's one of our worries, that we're going to get a flood of applications that might not have otherwise come in because they just don't think they're in an area that, so, I mean, we're open to that discussion, I think.
Yep.
Yeah.
I feel like, and to address some of my colleague from the north side's concerns, if you do put a floor in there, if it's and I thought part of the reason we were having the discussion around the floor being equated to the value of the property was because there's little value in some parts of the city where we're offering the most incentive, and so it'd be very easy to reach that 100% target. or even if you adjusted it down to, 75% of the acquisition cost, I mean, down in my neck of the woods, I'll use it as an example, because I'm most familiar with it. But if you buy a property for $100,000, generally speaking, it's already updated. But, if you're not, so let's say you buy a place like mine for $50,000, or I buy the vacant property next door for 20 grand, it's very easy to put $20,000 into rehabbing a property that's been vacant for 20 years. So for me, it doesn't make any sense to just say, okay, well, you bought this property for $20,000, you're going to put sweat equity into it, great, we're going to give you, 10 years at 95%. I just, and all you need to do is like paint the outside of the, house and, reap whatever benefit that might be, even if it's minimal. It just doesn't seem like it's an effective use of anyone's time, really.
Well, that's I guess the key, because I don't think it's going to make any difference, as Otis mentioned, to the bottom line as the city, because if you're just doing minimal work inside the house, the assessor isn't going to change the assessed value anyway, so the tax abatement has absolutely no value. Are no downside for the city. But as we said, if you all want to amend this and put some language in there, we have no objection to that at all. It's just that we didn't come to a meeting of the minds of everybody as to what that language should be.
The other thing that, has been brought up before that, I wanted to discuss is the use of tax abatement for a marketing tool versus actually a financing tool to help with the, development of the project, kind of that like but-for clause. And so, we actually, in my last committee hearing, had a property in the Central West End. It was a not so great block in the Central West End. But generally speaking, it was a, developer, non-developer occupied property. So they were, developing it, rehabbing it themselves, but they weren't planning on living in it. They were going to sell the property. So in that case, it's not actually needed in order to complete the project. The project was going to get done one way or another. It was just being used as a tool to then sell the property. And so how are we going to address those situations? Because, we don't really need a marketing tool to sell properties in the West End or the Hill or Shaw. I mean, those are areas that are very much, sought out. I think 63110 is like one of the like hottest zip codes in the entire region. So like how are we addressing that?
Well, of
Or
course,
are we planning to
any
address
tax abatement on a piece of property that's being developed by a developer and he's going to sell the property, it's a marketing tool. I mean, there isn't, regardless what neighborhood it's in, that's essentially what it is. It's an ability for the developer to sell his property with a lower mortgage rate. So I don't think it makes any difference what neighborhood it's in. That's really what it is. And I mean, that could be critical in selling some of these properties, and actually might encourage the developer to do a better job and spend a lot more money on the property because he knows he can still sell it at a reasonable amount for a developer. So I mean, I agree with you,
I guess
but
my question, the developer's not reaping the benefit of that.
that's only that he can sell the property more easily, perhaps.
So, perhaps, right? But what I'm saying though is, in 63110, I mean, zip codes are much larger than census tracts, right? And so you have, 63110, which is kind of in the south central part of the city, and / southwest part of the city. And there's areas that still qualify for tax abatement on this map, but they don't really need the sales incentive in order to get people to move in there. I mean, it's one of the hottest zip codes in the entire region. So why would we incentivize it as a sales tool? I mean, does that make sense? Am I crazy?
It does to me, because I've been looking at that. So I think the issue, I mean, you could also make the argument that in some ways it's also a sales tool for the owner-occupied rehabber. I mean, yes, it goes directly to his cost, but he could also pay some, you know, and that person could also buy a house that's tax rehab. So, I mean, that's a policy issue, and I think the issue that I've seen is awarding abatement and it not even being advertised as part of the listing. At that point, you know, what's the point? So, I mean, I think the map, as I said, the map does not solve all issues, but I think it does solve some of the issues in some of these areas. But also, what we'd like to look at is in some of those tricky cases, like you brought up. I've been trying to look at sales comps and those listings to see, are people, number one, are you awarding tax abatement in an area that other people that homes are selling quickly, and for good value. I mean, even off of Cherokee, there's examples of homes that have been redeveloped without tax abatement, selling for same or similar prices than homes that are utilizing tax abatement. So it's an issue in the green areas, but it's also an issue in other areas. So, I mean, that's something through the use of looking at sales comps can be addressed when those concerns arise. And I mean, we talk about exceptions. Those exceptions could occur on the negative side too. That the map says it should be awarded, you know, 10 years at 100 or 10 years at 90%, and the alderman says, you know, I don't think it deserves it. And now the issue is if that's not in your ward, I understand. But I've been trying to look at that through the use of sales comps in a developer model for single-family homes. But it's something we can definitely continue to take a look at. I don't know that there's a specific answer now other than what we'll call the negative exception process to look at that. But
Right.
I mean, that's something I'm more than willing to continue looking at, because I think it is, especially as neighborhoods improve, that's where you kind of get that issue where there's,
Right. Yeah. Okay, thank you, Matt. And I'll actually start taking questions from the committee. Alderman Moore, Alderwoman Howard.
I have no questions. I think I do have a comment, however, I think this is a quite comprehensive way of dealing with abatements, and I think it brings transparency and visibility to how this process is arrived. So I look forward to working with you and continuing the process and developing more of a clear and concise process on abatements for residential.
Well, good. That's certainly our objective, and we know there are going to be exceptions, and we're going to be we've always been dealing with that, and we'll continue to deal with that, but at least it gives a fairly uniform way to begin with.
You know, in my area, I haven't had that many of them, and haven't dealt with that many of them, but I think it provides a framework for us to be able to work from and identify developers that may be interested in working with us to improve our areas. Thank you.
Right.
And I'll add, it also helps set expectations for developers, you know, in terms of what they can expect when they do a project in any particular part of the city. So I think that that's a huge benefit as well. Alderwoman Hubbard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a few questions, but before questions, I'll just make a comment. I feel as a city, we should be going above and beyond to offer whatever type of incentives we have for North St. Louis. If you ride down some of those blocks, we have blocks with like maybe one house on it, and you know, whatever we can do to keep people in those neighborhoods, I feel that we should be doing that. It's a blessing that they're still there. I know in some situations, if I was in that position, I probably would have moved out because it looks so bad, and you know, it's been like that for 60 plus years due to a lot of things, and specifically due to the city not allocating the proper resources to make North St. Louis look as it does in other parts of the city. But specifically in regards to the Fifth Ward, I would just like to know how you all came up with some of these colors on this map. If you look at it, right in like the downtown portion, I think at like 12th and 13th Street, it's being warranted more tax abatement than an area right north of it. And then just specifically throughout the entire ward, with the exception of our downtown area, I'm concerned as to why it's not being recommended that they receive the maximum regarding tax abatement when we have some neighborhoods that don't have one single-family home in it. We've created a low-income housing corridor in those areas. So I'm just curious to how you all, I guess, divvied up the Fourth Ward in those decisions that you made regarding abatement.
John and Matt are looking at the map, trying to figure out exactly what area you're concerned about.
Look at right at, I guess that's 12th and 13th Street. I can barely see it. It's red up to 10 years at 95% plus 5 years at 50%. And then if you go just maybe a block west, I guess, west or south, I can't tell on this map. It's saying up to 10 years at 95%.
I think what she's referring to is the orange that's in like census block 1275.
Right. And I was
So
just
if you
curious.
specifically
It's an
know
orange.
what the numbers are
It's
there.
orange and between like a purple and red.
Yeah.
So I could go back and take a look at the numbers and figure out what those numbers are specifically for that census block, and email if you'd like. But generally, the way I can explain how the map was developed was we took a look at 8 different variables, all variables that were used to measure the sort of
Is
health.
that in our handout somewhere with those 8 variables on it?
Yep. Mm-hmm. But we used 8 variables to measure the health of the residential market throughout the city. Those variables you can see on this Making the Map slide, they were the median home value, which we broke up into 8% of it was the home value and 2% was the home value per room. Median income, which was 25% of the map, we used the change in income over the last 5 years, median rents, and building vacancies. Then we also use mortgage activity data, where we use the number of mortgages issued per 1,000 population, the average loan amount for home mortgages, and the total amount of mortgages divided by all owner-occupied buildings to sort of get an idea of how many dollars are being spread out among how many units within each area. And so then what we did with all those variables individually was we used a statistical process called standardization, which if you're familiar with the bell curve, basically standardization is just figuring out where every block fits in sort of like the bell curve of the city. And then it calculates the average value for each of those variables across the entire city, and then sort of figures out how far, what's the distance for each individual block group from the average, which is a term called the standard deviation. So we use that process to sort of figure out where every block group sat relative to all other block groups in the city. So that was the first step. And then the next step was we did a normalization process, which is where we created an index basically between 0 and 1. So normalization basically just means you're doing a percentage. You're basically making everything so it's comparable. So we created the index, and then we set the index value of 1 equal to the regional average for all of the different variables. And then so we did that individually for all the variables, and then we weighted them according to these percent weightings you see on this this slide. So when we did that, that basically then said, okay, this is the makeup. This is sort of like the metric measuring the health. And so because this area is in orange, what that means is that it is somewhere between 45%, well, it's greater than 45% and 60% of the regional average. So if the regional average is X, it's 0.46 to 0.6% of X. And basically that's how everything was done. That's how it was done in order to basically keep everything, relative to each other according to its economic and health, I guess. The thing that's, I would say that everything that I've described to this point was a very objective process. We did have to use some judgment to figure out the weighting of the variables, and I can explain that if you guys wish, why we used the weighting we did. But really where there was a little bit more, I would say, of our judgment that came in was trying to figure out where to create the break lines, what you see, the 0.35, the 0.45, the 0.6, and so on. And basically what we just tried to do is we just tried to create about an even spread between groupings for the most part. The last one used to be 0.3, but it was changed by the HUD's committee to 0.35. And so the downside to having groupings like this is that you could have a block that's just above 0.45, and I don't know if that's the case for this one. It might be, it might not be. It could be at 0.46, but that kicks it over to the next category. Mm-hmm. But that's just the nature of doing a map, unfortunately. I mean, if you were to say every decimal point equals a different amount of incentive, which theoretically you could, but then the way to map that there'd be so many colors on the map that it wouldn't help you. It wouldn't help anybody. So,
talking more general term too is as I said in the presentation, we all have our preconceptions. I'm not saying your preconception is wrong here, but what I'm saying is that we couldn't just kind of paint what we think because you guys would disagree with what we paint and this alderman would disagree with what this alderman paints. So we had to base the map on numbers. So so everything is based on those underlying numbers that are there. So as we went through the process to try to match kind of some of these preconceptions and some where we thought there was consensus, in order to make that census block group that is now orange to be purple, then you'd have to realize that every orange census block group in the city would need to be purple. I think what we need, that's where the exception process comes in. I think first off, John and I will send you the numbers and why it's orange as opposed to purple or red, and maybe something out of that will answer your question. Beyond that, I think that's where the exception process comes in. If there is a project there that needs the purple level of incentives, you can request that. We can do the analysis and we can take it from there. But we acknowledge that every census tract on this, every census block group on this map is not going to map every alderman's expectations for their ward. But we just have to have, I think the resolution comes, number one, now we have a map so we can talk about it and we can show you the numbers. And number two, we do have the exception process as kind of a backup mechanism to solve a specific issue that you might have.
I think the other thing is the Car Square tenant management is doing such an excellent job managing property up in that part of the Fifth Ward that it's,
That wasn't what I was referencing.
The median rent is probably, stabilizing the area.
I don't have one single family home, though. That's a problem. That's a problem.
Yeah, well, I think, again, as has already been said, if a developer comes in and wants to develop a block that only has one house in it, that's an exception to all the standards, and we're going to be, doing everything we can to provide incentives for that sort of thing to happen. Again, a lot of the only development really that has occurred so far in a lot of these areas has been affordable housing, and as we mentioned, affordable housing trumps everything anyway in terms of an incentive. So I don't think just because it's shown as orange and the fellows will show you the numbers as to why it's orange. That's not in any way going to hold us back in providing great incentives for any project that wants to come in there.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that because if you look at the ward and its boundaries and how diverse it is. I mean, from one side of the street to the next, things change. It's a world of difference. Like downtown, even before you hit Washington Avenue, you may have a few lofts, but then stone's throw away, you have Cochran Gardens, which is low-income housing. So when I looked at this, it kind of, made me say, okay, well, this may not necessarily be the right thing to do, but I understand you all had a formula that you went by and a template that you were using, but it's my hope that we will do things on a case-by-case basis, because
no question.
everything is not always just cut and dry. So I thank you for your time, and I'm looking forward to talking more in depth about the different incentives that are being offered in my ward. Thank you.
Does that address your concerns, though? Okay. Alderwoman Murphy?
No questions, thank you.
Alderwoman Spencer, I know I saw you jotting down a ton of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Some of these are just innocuous notes
Oh,
for the
wonderful.
record.
Even better.
I want to thank you all for being here today. This has been very helpful. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to weigh in this committee in particular, because we do see a lot of tax incentives through the Neighborhood Development Committee, and I think it's imperative that these types of discussions happen in both HUDs and neighborhood development, so I appreciate the opportunity. I want to talk a little bit about the reporting system. This was mentioned earlier. I think having a reporting system is going to be very crucial to the success of this and any sort of citywide program that we try to initiate. I'd like to see some data previous to the incentive reform, and so that we can compare this, how this is functioning as in some meaningful metrics. Whether that looks like total incentive, including total incentives per year versus before versus after, and kind of how that's happening. One thing that's kind of missing, I think, from the conversation is an overall plan for how income distribution and development is overall distributed through the city from an ideal perspective. I see there's large swaths here that have no tax incentives, but what I could see is these are areas that are really stabilized and have a presumably higher income. And what could be useful to those areas is to have some mixed income woven in through them. Single-family homes that are, for example, developed by Habitat for Humanity, or have a lower income associated with them. Apartment buildings that may fit an affordable housing need in neighborhoods that don't have that. And so I could see incentivizing projects like that in areas that are currently green. And so
That's one of the primary exceptions, though, so absolutely.
So I think
absolutely, we all agree with that.
And I think we want to not only have that as an exception, but encourage it and look for it and try and drive some of that, because we do have a lot of affordable housing in other parts of the city, but I think to strive for mixed income neighborhoods across the city, especially including those neighborhoods that are already well stabilized, it would be a good thing. I'd also, one thing that I see missing, I don't know if this has been talked about in HUDs, but maybe an increased tax incentive for city-owned properties. We have a lot of properties that are owned by the city right now, and to maybe add a little extra incentive to getting those off our current property rolls would be a good thing. Is this something that has been?
We would agree with that.
And I think too, if you look at the map.
I mean, I realize
If you look at the map of LRA-owned properties.
I mean, if you're picking up a property in Gravois Park on the market, I'd like to see those city-owned properties carry, be purple everywhere, no matter even if it's in a orange zone, just to get them out of the city inventory. So I realize that maybe this is a done deal for this, maybe we can include some structural changes but I would personally like to see a way that we can increase incentives because it would reduce the drain on the city.
That could be added as an exception in that, I don't have the resolution in front of me, but in the section where it lists the exceptions, sort of like the automatic ones, there's 3 of them currently. Wanted to do that, that'd be up to you.
I'd like to echo the request to send the white paper, as well as the model that's been developed by Jonathan Ferry, just for our knowledge. Some of us are more savvy than others, but the white paper certainly would be helpful, just to see what's going to be given to the general public in more layman's terms, as kind of was mentioned. If that could be sent sooner than later, I think that'd be very helpful. You mentioned public outreach, Team TIF specifically. Do we have formal input from organized members of the general public on this topic? Has any organization such as Team TIF or Washington University or SLACO or any other organization submitted a formal set of input on this resolution? And have we solicited it?
I did have some pretty in-depth conversations with some of the members of Team TIF.
The problem with the conversation between you and Team TIF is that it's not shareable with the broader community, right?
Right.
So, and this isn't a criticism on you at all, but what I'm looking for is a formal set of recommendations or input from any organization that says, here are our recommendations. Does that exist?
I don't know that they've posted something other than like stuff they've put on their
Online?
website, you know.
Okay.
But I don't know that they've sent anything to us
Okay.
formally like that.
I mean, they certainly have had an opportunity, but I
Sure.
don't know that they've done it.
Sure. It's hard to take in input from organizations without having that in front of us, so I can appreciate that, and I, would have preferred to have some formalized perspective from them available to us because they have been so involved in the process. One concern I'd like to mention about the map in general, one is that my concern would be that developers or homeowners that are purchasing or developing in areas that allow tax abatement might feel entitled to tax abatement because they see they're in a zone. Have we thought about that in terms of what this may do to explode applications for tax abatement and how we might address that?
Well, definitely, we've thought about it. I don't know what, I guess only time will tell. As you're indicating, we're going to have to keep records of what our tax abatement level has been in the past and how this might affect it one way or another. But obviously, if it's a project that doesn't warrant tax abatement, regardless how many of those we may get in, I don't think we're going to be in a position that all of us will agree that they should get it just because they apply for it.
Okay. I want to switch back to the ceilings. I was a little bit surprised that the ceiling was as high as it is. This is, again, is not criticism, but $400,000 is quite high. And I was just a little surprised that, not to say that we couldn't support tax abatement for houses of that high value, but that the abatement would go that high. Has there been any discussion in looking at a lower threshold, and has there been any discussion in imposing a rate cap on multi-unit developments, for example?
This is per unit. So.
Well, if I'm looking at a 4-family flat, if I've got a $400,000 cap per unit, that's, $1.6 million is really, really, really high, right? So I would think that on a per unit basis for a multifamily development, it would be significantly lower than $400,000 and perhaps in the neighborhood of $100,000 per unit or $125,000 per unit. Has that been discussed previously?
Well, yeah, actually, we proposed a lower amount, and through
Is that right?
discussions with the committee, it has raised. It has been raised.
Really?
Yeah, HUD's raised it to that level.
I'm sorry, HUD's did?
HUD's raised it to that level.
Can you describe the original recommended caps that were suggested by SLDC?
We were talking about a number equal to 2 times the median home value, I think, for the region.
Okay.
Which would have been around $265,000, I think.
What was the rationale for increasing that cap to $400,000? I'm asking because I apologize, I wasn't involved in those hearings.
I can only answer by trying to speak on behalf of other people.
Which probably we shouldn't do.
Which we
You may
probably
not ask
shouldn't do,
Members of the
yeah.
HUD's committee.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, I think they were just concerned about putting too much of a limitation on it or something, I don't know. I don't
And I'm
know
not
exactly
suggesting
why.
that we eliminate tax abatement entirely for those higher value homes, especially in areas, for example, that are purple or red. I think to have a $400,000 home in Baden would be phenomenal. I think those are good projects that we want to,
I think that had a lot to do with their reasoning, that if somebody wanted to come into a troubled area and build a $500,000 house, why wouldn't we want to
Help
give
them
them
do
all
it.
the incentives in the world to do that?
I can appreciate that. But again, my concern is that the cap is kind of high and that there's not a cap for the multifamily unit. Then I'll just have a couple of other little,
Comment on the multifamily. I mean, very quickly, when you get into not so much four-family, but larger, it's going to be above $1 million, so this isn't going to be the deciding factor anyway. So in larger multifamilies, it's going to be the financial model that's going to control and not necessarily the model,
okay.
or the map, rather.
My last two, the example here is good. This example provided here, but I did want to point out that this example is not applicable to what we're discussing here. This is a $4.5 million project, and what we're looking at by way of this resolution is residential projects under $1 million.
Yeah,
So-
I was going to say, I mean, the presentation was just a general presentation. Obviously, the focus was on the map, but
Sure.
it was to address concerns and issues that we realized with the model too, and explaining what we were trying to do to improve, explaining what we were trying to do to make improvements to
Sure.
the model.
But just for
Yeah,
consistency.
the last 2 or 3 pages don't relate to the map at all. They relate to the model, so, you know,
But
it's just
still,
to give a more rounded presentation.
But it can be, it would be.
Under $1 million wouldn't have this analysis.
Exactly, and so since that's what we're discussing here, I just figure it would be more relevant to have an example that fit in with the overall discussion. And speaking of that, I would like, I don't see Jonathan's famous partial star system, and it's my hopefully final request that we do away with that particular ranking system and instead go with something, with a baseline of 20 or 100 or 10 or some rounded figure that would be standardized as part of it. I know the intent, Jonathan, is very good, and I understand that you do a very, very good job and very detailed, but the star system is very confusing.
3-star 0.75.
So if we could do away with that, that would be very helpful. I'm impressed with the amount of work that's gone into this. I think having a citywide plan is a very good thing. I do have concerns that the map itself could explode the amount of requests for tax abatement, the feeling of entitlement to tax abatement. I'd be very curious to see how that moves forward. That being said, I think a map is necessary, and we do need some of these very clearly defined areas. So I think that's a good thing, and I'm looking forward to the reporting system, the white paper, and again, my only real concern is that ceiling seems a bit high. I'm glad we're looking at annual review, and all in all, I'm grateful for the discussion here in neighborhood development. Mr. Chairman, that's all I have. And with that, would you like to take questions for Alderman Gunther?
Alderman Gunther.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also had a similar concern to the Alderwoman from the 20th about that cap at 400, so I appreciate your explanation of that. I do think, if we're going to be incentivizing $400,000 homes, that yes, you know, in the reds and the purples areas, great, but in these areas that are the light yellow, light green, that maybe they should be considered a different incentive being needed. So, but want to just, a couple things. So, kind of procedure now with when someone was applying for an abatement, I would get the call from Mr. Wilson saying that here is a process. So, here's an application. So now that you have this map and you have dark green areas and someone applies, will we still be notified that, oh, here's an application coming in for this, but it's in a dark green area, so we're so that we still have the ability to say, oh, wait, that might be a spot that's an exception?
Yeah, I think I mentioned earlier that when we have our agenda prep meeting, we all get together, we look at all the applications, and if one, for a variety of reasons, we're recommending no abatement, you'll be notified, the developer will be notified, and we'll talk about it. And if it's okay with you, we'll proceed with that. If it's not, if it doesn't make sense and you raise a whole series of questions, we may just postpone even having that on the agenda until we resolve what makes sense on that area.
Yeah. So is it the policy now that every time an application comes in that you notify us of all the ones that are being applied for, or?
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, only if it gets recommended by LCRA.
No, we'll notify you if we're not recommending tax abatement for an application, definitely. Because you may have very good reasons why, again, unknown to us, it's the worst building in the block, it's a crack house, whatever it may be, and there are great reasons why we should provide an incentive for it.
And that's kind of, yeah, I was just kind of following up on this last page here where you're saying that you're adding the projects where abatements are not recommended to the agenda, and I think that's a great idea. So I just wanted to make sure that you're also...
We don't put that on the agenda until you've been notified.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I was wondering. And then the other thing, so we have a potential addition of another kind of gray spot. Yeah, another area where there might be a gray spot. So my question is in concerns to, I'm absolutely in support of, where you're saying, okay, if it's affordable development, if it's a historic home that might need a little bit of additional cost because it's been sitting for so long, because it's been in our city land bank for 25 years and it's falling apart, or if it's a lead. But the other one I was concerned about was mixed use. So where does mixed use fit into?
Well, this map doesn't deal with mixed use.
Okay, not at all.
It deals only with totally residential properties.
Okay.
So we look at it, in a different way if it's a mixed-use property.
Okay.
I mean, we'll certainly look at the map, and that will be a guide, but the model will be more what we'll look at on a mixed-use project.
All right, because I have, as most of our neighborhoods do, but we have quite a few of those corner storefronts that have the residential above it, and if we want to try to incentivize, keeping commercial space on the first floor and residential above so that we can have some live-work space, stuff like that, I think that would be something that, would be great to say, oh, hey, we add an incentive if you want to keep it commercial, but if you're going to just turn it all into residential, then maybe you're in, on the middle of Benton Park on Pestalozzi, that you don't need an incentive for just straight residential, but if you're going to put a storefront in and add a couple of neighborhood jobs, then that might be something to look at. But so that won't be addressed on this map at all. They'll be right. Okay. All right.
What would be addressed is your example there is if they're taking a commercial space and turning it into a residential property, then it would then go to the map, and then we would see where it lays, and then speak with you about where, does this need an exception? Do we need to, because we're taking a commercial space and lowering its use to residential only, do we need to, maybe it's showing 15 years, 10 years at 90%, but you don't agree with that because you want to keep it a commercial space, then that's a discussion that we can have, and I think would, generally support just kind of, just as a hypothetical.
Yep. Okay. All right, I think that was the only questions I had. Thank you.
There's some other alderwomen in the room, so I want to make sure that we, hear their questions as well. Alderwoman Ingracia, do you have any questions? Okay, Alderwoman Rice.
I do. Thanks so much, guys. My question is actually procedurally with the blighting studies. Where do those fall within what we're doing now? Are they still being approved if we're not recommending abatement? How's that going to work?
Well, I'm not quite sure I understand. When you say blighting study, you mean the recommendation for tax abatement?
Well, so it's my understanding that in the recent months, not since this committee hasn't been meeting, but things had been going through the LCRA that an abatement was not recommended, but a blighting study was still approved, so an alderman could.
Oh, okay. No, we're not doing that anymore.
Okay.
No, I mean, you're right. We had done that in the past for a little while, but no, we're not doing that.
Okay.
No.
So this is packaged together. If there's no abatement, then there's also no blighting study.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right.
All
Exactly.
right. That's really all I had. Thank you.
Okay.
Great. And I don't see any other alder people in the room, so that concludes the comments and questions. My understanding was that there was a motion on Friday to move the resolution to the Neighborhood Development Committee, which would then require a vote for this to be passed out. But our legal counsel is saying that, am I correct in understanding that you don't believe that that was done? And so it's still just sitting on the informal calendar and we're just hearing it in this committee today. That's not my understanding, but I'm going to defer to our legal counsel on that. So with that, if there's no other questions or comments, then the meeting is concluded. Thank you, everyone, for your time. I really appreciate you all being here
Good.
today.
Well, thank you. Good.
Thank you.